Okay, and then okay, Paula, you now are the host. Um, okay, good evening, everyone. If you don't know me already, I'm Pat Shea, and I'm pinch hitting here tonight for Olivia, who is vacationing somewhere in Europe. Um, so I know. um, so I found out about this. I guess it was last week, and the restoration group at here at Virginia Tech that I'm part of, we went on a field trip to a place very similar to the one where Paula works or is associated with. I'm not sure. Unfortunately, Jim knows more about Paula than I do. So all I can say is that she is associated with the Soldiers Field Natural Area. I'm not sure the official name, but anyway, I will turn it over to Paul. I've said enough. Thank you for being here this evening. We really appreciate it. And have at it.
All right. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me. And happy almost autumn. I am giddy that the temperatures have dropped below 80. I am
Paula, can I ask? I'm sorry to interrupt one more time. Real quick. If there are questions, would you prefer them in the chat or for people to jump in, or do you want to wait till the end with chat questions?
You can jump in. You can interrupt if you want.
Okay. All right. All right. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
So again, good evening, everyone. I am Paula Becker. I am with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources Natural Heritage Program, which is the agency that deals with non-game and endangered species and ecosystems in this case. So before I get started, how many of you have actually been to Soldier's Delight Natural Environment Area in Baltimore County? You can do a show of hands. You can shout out in the chat. Carol has. Carol Bergman, have you not been to Soldier's Delight? I could have sworn I'd seen you at Soldiers. Okay, so a few of you have. If you haven't been, you should go. It is kind of rugged hiking for the Piedmont, but it is a truly interesting and inspiring place. So let me start. Can everyone see this? Can I get a thumbs up? Okay. So on Tuesday, April 4th, 2023, there was an unexpected fire at Soldier's Delight Natural Environment Area. It was described as a brush fire on the news. It was not the result of a prescribed burn. It was not the result of a lightning strike. So it began around 3 p.m. in the afternoon. By 6 a.m. the next morning, it was contained, but it was not fully extinguished for several more days. It took several days to get the rest of all the smoldering fuel. So by the numbers, oops, come on. It goes, by the numbers, it was an 8-alarm fire. It required the services of 200 firefighters from the Maryland State Forest Service, the Maryland State Park Service, several surrounding county fire departments, and the Army National Guard and the Pennsylvania Forestry Department, Department of Forestry provided air support with helicopters bringing buckets of water from Liberty Reservoir, which fortunately is right next door. Although the news said it was a 700-acre burn, they overestimated by a smidgen. It was 321.4 acres that were burned. I'm cutting them some slack because when smoke is everywhere and you do not know the terrain, It is very easy to overestimate things like this when there is fire and your fight or flight senses are heightened. 29 families, or approximately 80 people, were evacuated from their homes. 2 sheds burned completely, and 1 house suffered some damage on one of its walls. But miraculously, there were no major injuries. 1 firefighter suffered from dehydration. But beyond that, from a human structure perspective, it was pretty miraculous. Now, from a fire suppression angle, it was actually a pretty amazing job, because this part of Soldier's Delight is a combination of grasslands and patches of woods that are primarily greenbrier wrapped around Virginia pine. And that's what makes all of that smoke. And we have some really great aerial footage about an hour and 20 minutes from WBAL, Pie in the Sky, or Sky Team 11, which has been great for us because we can analyze how the fire moved through the property. Now, the Maryland Forest Service Fire Management Unit and the Baltimore County Fire Marshal's Office have each completed their own investigations. They compared their investigations. A final report has not yet been issued. But I can tell you that from an ecological perspective, this was not a tragedy. Several of my volunteers and some of our friendly neighbors up there have called saying, we're so sorry to hear about the decimated area at Soldier's Delight. And I have to tell them, fire is not necessarily a bad thing. Unexpected, unplanned fire can be a bad thing, but fire in and of itself is not necessarily bad. Because for almost 9,000 years at this location, fire has actually been shaping the ecosystem. It is absolutely necessary to how we believe this ecosystem can be its healthiest. So I would like to tell you what we learned from both history and from fires like this that have guided our restoration efforts at Soldier's Delight. Now, Soldier's Delight is a 2,000 plus acre property in Owings Mills in western Baltimore County. It is administered by the Maryland State Park Service through Patapsco Valley State Park. But it is not a park. It is a natural environment area. Here's the difference. Parks are for people. Natural environment areas have been conserved specifically because of the natural environment on that property. So our management techniques are going to be a little bit different. It is also a designated wildland, which is sort of the state equivalent of a national or a federal wilderness area. So it's special for a lot of different legal reasons, in addition to its ecological importance. Now, what happened during the pandemic was that a lot more people came out and started using our public lands, which is a good thing. We want people to use the public lands. They're public. We want people to get out. We want them to appreciate what is there. We want them to be healthy. The challenge for our public lands, particularly in Maryland, is at Soldier's Delight, it experienced more than twice its pre-pandemic level of visitation. At Patapsco Valley State Park, which is just down the road, they experienced almost 4 times their pre-pandemic visitation. So there was a lot more impact from people. So we're actually sort of getting back to how it was before the pandemic, a little at a time. But it's a great place to visit. I mean, it's got 7 miles of trails at Soldier's Delight. It is the highest elevation in that part of the county at 700 feet above sea level. It is outside of the city light influence from both Baltimore and Owings Mills, which means it's a great place to view the stars. So it's therefore popular with astronomers. As a grassland ecosystem, it's popular with botanists and birders and butterfly enthusiasts. Geologists dig it because it has unusual bedrock. And over several hundred years, it has hosted a variety of human activities. And by the way, it's haunted, and they do a heck of a haunted Halloween hike in October. So check that out. But as I said, it is a natural environment area and a wildland. Ecologically speaking, we refer to it as a serpentine barrens or an oak savanna. Barrens is an old English word meaning it doesn't support trees big enough to provide lumber. And our retired state restoration ecologist, Dr. Wayne Tyndall, likes to say that if the Spanish had got there first, they would have called it a savanna, specifically an oak savanna, because it what we are restoring it to, what it was like before it came under our care, was a large open grassland with patches of oak, primarily post oak and blackjack oak. And one of the elements that is, of course, the foundation is the bedrock. It's called serpentine or serpentinite. It is an ultramafic rock, which means that it is derived from an igneous rock, and it is high in iron and magnesium, but very low in calcium. And that ratio between calcium and magnesium is really important because calcium is the mineral that allows plants to take up other nutrients. So if your calcium level is low, the plants have to find, they either have to be very sturdy in this depauperate soil, or they need to have another way to take up nutrients. The Earth's mantle is made out of this kind of ultramafic rock. And at Soldiers, it also means that it's high in other minerals like nickel, manganese, talc, asbestos, chromium, and the soils are very low in organic material. So all of this comes together to make a very droughty soil. And this dry, droughty soil is what sort of drives the shape of this ecosystem. The formation of the soil is really kind of important. It's important enough that we should just review it very quickly, so you can really kind of take in the amazing thing that this soil and this bedrock is. So picture it 500 million years ago, where the shoreline of North America looked decidedly different, mostly because it was in Nebraska. The continental plates are sort of sloshing slowly towards one another, and it will take and bumping and spinning as they go. You'll notice that magnetic north is actually on the left side of your screen, not at the top. So North America, as we know it, is sort of torqued to starboard. And 500 million years ago, what is now Soldier's Delight was under the ocean. Now, ultramafic magma comes out where two tectonic plates bump together. That's why we have the Ring of Fire in the Pacific. And it's where the African plate is bumping up against the North American plate. So you can see that line of ultramafic magma there in red. And that little yellow dot is sort of close to where Maryland is going to end up. So let's move forth a little bit. The plates are coming closer together. A little bit more of North America is starting to lift up above the oceans. It's getting closer and closer. And I find at this point, this is when it helps to have sound effects. So everybody make a smashing sound with me. Can you feel it? I know you can. So that dotted line there is what will become this line of serpentine bedrock and serpentine soil. And that line goes from New York State and Massachusetts all the way down to the Carolinas, but there are still a few discrete pieces up in Quebec and all the way down in Alabama. Then the plates start pulling apart, Africa starts heading back in its direction, and the surface gets folded back and forth. So some of this ultramafic rock is now diving down. I like to describe it like a whale breaching the surface and diving back down again. So it's not a solid band of serpentine at the surface. It pops up in different places. So that 60 million years ago, we start seeing something that looks a little bit more like North America as we know it. Now, around 9,000 to 5,000 years ago, there was a period, which is after the last ice age, there was a period known as the Holocene climate optimum, which just meant it was a lot warmer. And there are a whole lot of other terms that basically means it was a lot warmer. My personal favorite is the hypsothermal. So the hypsothermal means that this is the period where the ecosystem at Soldier's Delight, as we know it, began to take shape in the presence of the serpentine, in the presence of warmer weather, and in the presence of activities by humans. So what did the serpentine band look like at the time? Right now, there are still some patches of serpentine that breach the surface. Soldier's Delight is one. You can see up near the Maryland-Pennsylvania border, there are two lovely sites known as Pilot Serpentine Barren or State Line Barrens. And then as you head south into Virginia, you can see patches again. Systems. They're not all identical because the pressures at these different locations are different enough that the soils that they form are going to be a little bit different. So let's talk about the soil. If you go to Soldier's Delight, you may see patches of open ground like this. That's the bedrock. That's the stuff that 200 million years ago was under the ocean. So the soils that are there, particularly at the top of the ridges, tend to be very thin and again, low in organic material, so that any plants that are going to survive there have to be able to survive and indeed thrive under these conditions. And that includes a lot of warm seeds and grasses like big blue stem, little blue stem, Indian grass, which is also called yellow prairie grass. And these are bunch grasses that have very robust underground root systems. And then you'll find a lot of wildflowers that are tolerant of mineral soils. And those pines in the background, these are a very recent addition. So there are two major serpentine soils, but they both arise from the same bedrock. The first is a shallow, rocky, sandy loam. You can see it's very shallow. It's under 10 centimeters deep. It tends to be mostly sand, a little bit of silt, and even less clay, and it's sort of a neutral pH. The other one is a silty loam. It can be a couple of meters deep, and you can see it's mostly silt, very little sand, and a much more acidic pH. So where they occur is important because these are the soil types that we're dealing with when we talk about where our burn units are. The majority of the rare species that we are hoping to make a little less rare by supporting their ecosystem can be found on the first soil type, which is a shallow, the shallow sandy loam. The silty loam, because it is deeper, it can support plants with deeper roots. So that's going to include things like trees and greenbrier. And this is a picture of our restoration, but this is what we think it looked like 400 years ago before the Europeans came and changed the pressures on the earth. And really at this point, when we're talking about restoration work, we are talking about restoration to what this probably looked like before the Europeans colonized the area. And we really need to acknowledge the people who were here before the Europeans, because not only do they have a much longer history and therefore a longer ecological understanding of the place, but we have benefited a lot from their knowledge about how the native peoples managed these properties and why and how, what was their goal in managing the land. And in this case, it was Soldier's Delight was not in a place that was the territory of one main tribe. There were actually several tribes that used it largely as a hunting ground. The Susquehannocks came down from the north, and the Piscataway came up from the south. And there's some evidence that tells us that the Tupelo and a few other tribes came from the west, actually came in all the way in from Ohio. But we know that the native peoples used fire as a tool. We know that they used fire to burn understories so that they could clear sight lines from their villages. We knew that they burned over the ground to clear it so they could farm it, to replenish some of the nutrients in the soil. And we know they used fire to move the deer herds so that they could more easily and efficiently hunt. So their actions, in addition to lightning strikes, which may have caused fire, are really built into the DNA, if you will, of this ecosystem. So we have to acknowledge that they were here first, that they gave up the land under duress, and yet we still benefited from their presence on that land. A lot of the written history that we have for this property comes from historian William Bowes-Marie. He did not publish it in an ecological journal. He published it in the Maryland Historical Magazine. These two major articles, The Great Maryland Barrens and The Old Indian Road, were absolutely essential in understanding what it was we were trying to restore this to. And he quotes a lot of sources from native peoples. Also, F.W. Porter III wrote a lot about how the settlement itself changed the shape of the ground and the landscape. Two quotes from William Bowes-Marie talks about how the native peoples used fire to move the deer. And he also lets us know that they did the majority of their burning in the autumn, which is key to how these ecosystems are shaped. With the arrival of the Europeans and the extirpation of the indigenous people in 1730, the serpentine ecosystem began to change because fire was no longer a regular presence on the ground, because the permanent dwellings of the Europeans were made of wood. So who wants their house to burn down, right? So fire was no longer there as a presence, as a disturbance on the ground. So there was no fire. The weather was warmer and a little wetter, and this began to favor more oak forests than the grasslands that had been there before. However, the Europeans did bring someone with them that would sort of mimic the impact of fire, and that would be the noble cow. Because although the fires stopped basically in 1730, livestock grazing in these areas that were largely grassland, they basically simulated fire going through and knocking back any of the woody species, and it kept the grasses disturbed every year, and the grasses respond to that disturbance by growing. Which leads me to remind us all that what you see on the landscape is a response to whatever is happening to that landscape, whether it be a disturbance like a fire or a flood, or a lack of disturbance, no fire, no flood. That is going to influence what plants and the animals that love them can survive on that ecosystem. So let's fast forward a couple hundred years into the mid-19th century, where someone discovered chromium in that ultramafic serpentine ore. So chromium mining began with Isaac Tyson, who had a mine up in the Bear Hills section of northwest Baltimore. And he set up mining operations at what is now Soldier's Delight. And his family, he and his sons, continued to mine mostly through the end of the 19th century. But what was going on? Here's a pop quiz for everyone. What was going on in the middle of the 19th century that would require large amounts of chromium? Anybody? You can type it in the chat. You can raise your hand and cry out. I'm not hearing anything. So it was the Industrial Revolution, and nothing uses up chromium like processing steel, right? It's in the Billy Joel song, Allentown, chromium steel, right? So for about 5 minutes in the middle of the 19th century, Soldier's Delight chromium supported the majority of the world's processing of steel. It was the global hub of chromium for global steel processing. Then I believe it was 1858, large amounts of chromium ore were discovered in Asia, primarily Turkey and China, and the bottom fell out of the Soldier's Delight chromium market. Although the Tyson family did continue to mine the property through the 1890s, and they shut it down in the 1890s, but they opened it back up again for World War I because we lost contact with other sources of chromium. So they supported the creation of tanks and ships until after the war, and they shut it down again at the end of the 1920s. So after that, the land was basically fallow. Boy Scouts camped there. Locals rode their horses through there. People hiked through using the old mining roads. Motorcycles used the place. But in about 1910, it started looking like this. So a blurry photo, but it was mostly open grassland. And then down in the gullies, where you might have that deeper serpentine soil, you're going to have trees growing. The real change came in the 1930s, when the bottom fell out of farming in the area, and a lot of the local farms closed up shop because it was no longer possible to successfully farm that area. It's also a very difficult place to dig a well, because basically you're cutting through bedrock the entire time. So it's a real challenge. So people moved off the land, and it was no longer being disturbed by coal mining or by chromium mining or by logging or by cattle grazing. And what happens, and there's still no fire burning there. So they have removed all of the major disturbance. And that is when the Virginia pine really started to get a root hold. Virginia pine can be very tolerant of depauperate soils. And so the Virginia pine would grow, and it would drop its needles and its cones, and it would change the composition of the soil. And when you do that, you get other plants that are not fire tolerant moving into that soil type. And that's really when it began to change from what was at one time a grassland to becoming early successional and pine forests. Fortunately, a wonderful group of people who were all locals and who had grown up appreciating the beauty of the place realized that it would be worth it to get this property conserved somehow. So William and Frances Fasty were on the original group grassroots effort to get the county at first and then the state to try and acquire all of the land and turn it into some kind of a conservation area. If any of you grew up in the neighborhood in the 50s and 60s, you may remember a Saturday morning TV show called Hodgepodge Lodge with Miss Jean. And the kids would skip through the meadow and come to Miss Jean's cabin, and she would teach them all about nature, and she would show them animals and plants. Well, Miss Jean was Jean Worthley, and she has a master's in zoology from University of Maryland, and her husband was Dr. Elmer Worthley, who was a botanist. So the people on this initial friends group knew their stuff, and they started fundraising. And they would stand outside supermarkets with big cans and say, $1 for conservation, $1 for conservation. And by this and other fundraising efforts, they were able to raise $25,000, which they then presented to the state as seed money to start land acquisitions. Now, first they went to Delegate Richard Rind, who's a delegate for that part of Baltimore County, who sadly passed away just last year. But he was the force that got it into the Maryland legislature and actually had the land purchased and brought under the umbrella of the Department of Natural Resources. The other force of nature who was part of this friends group was Ms. Florence Rogers, who could get blood from a stone. The woman was famous as a community organizer and fundraiser. And as you can see, she hobnobbed with the elite. Edward G. Robinson, the governor and his wife, she knew people who knew people. So we had all of the right people on this friends group. As I said, Delegate Richard Ryan was there, Mary Lewis, James Pulteney, Bernie Winker were the original members of this friends group, and they're the ones who facilitated the initial land acquisition. So fire, let's see if I can get this out of the way. There we go. Prior to European settlement, fire was a regular part of North American landscapes. We know this. We are learning more and more how much fire shaped the landscapes in the past and how much our landscapes have changed because we have suppressed fire on North American landscapes. So when we first decided in my program that we were going to do, and by we, I mean the people who were there before me, I was not there at the time. So the people at the time said, look, if we're going to restore this ecosystem, not just plant things and then replant them because they're not going to survive, what we need to do is to recreate the conditions under which this ecosystem formed. And that meant fire. So back in 1993, this is a color infrared of the main Serpentine area where we started our restoration work. And as a reference, here is a north-south major high tension power line right away. And to its east, you will find what is now the Visitor Center right off of Deer Park Road. And this is the area where we focused our initial restoration work. Now you'll see there are some openings already. That's the silvery blue stuff. These are open areas that had not been overgrown yet. The red is Virginia pine, and the sort of a dull gray green are hardwood forests. And this color infrared is from leaf off. So that's where we started our efforts. And this is what we saw when if you were to walk down, for instance, here is the Serpentine Trail that comes down and comes back up again. It's a 3-mile loop trail. If you were to walk down that, this is what you would have seen on both sides of the trail. Virginia pine, greenbrier. Both of these species are not fire tolerant. We know this because when we burn them now, well, you can see the pictures from the April 4th fire. A lot of dark smoke. These are also fairly dangerous fuels because they're not fire tolerant. They're both full of very volatile oils. But what kind of wildlife might you expect to see in a forest like this? Well, you might see, well, you will see deer, you'll see foxes and rabbits, some birds, but mostly they're common species because a habitat like this is very limited and it doesn't support as many species as a more plant diverse habitat. So this is what was missing. So we decided, okay, we're going to use fire. What is our management goal in fire? It is to mimic the natural processes to restore a fully functioning ecosystem. In our case, specifically for rare species, because again, my program is the Rare Species Management Program. So for those of you who have not participated in a prescribed burn before, what sorts of questions might we ask before we put fire on the ground? Well, we're going to ask things like, how often should we burn? Do we have to burn every year? Is it safe to burn every year? Well, if we go back and we look at soil records, we can see when there is ash in the soil. So we know that the natural burn period for this area is about once every 3 to 7 years. So in our individual burn units that we have at Soldier's Delight, we try and burn them roughly every 3 to 7 years. We aim for 5 years, but if we miss it, it's okay. We're still in the pocket. When would be the most common time for a natural fire? Well, that's going to be in the summer when there are lightning strikes from big hot thunderstorms. That is also the least safe time to do a prescribed burn because it's the driest time of year. So we don't burn in the summer because it's uncontrollable. And what we are aiming to do is a controlled burn. That's what it says on the sign. And this is Dr. Wayne Tyndall, who was the mastermind, basically, of our burn program at Soldier's Delight. He was the original state restoration ecologist who figured out the answers to all of these questions. So what happens if we burn a fire at a different time of year? Well, as it turns out, because there is different fuel at different times of year, your fires are going to behave differently. And the results of those fires are going to be different on the landscape. For instance, if we burn earlier in the year, say in April, we are going to be burning the early flush of trees and herbaceous plants. Then they can come back because they are pulling stored nutrients from the root systems. If we burn in the fall, we are burning plants that are at their peak of nutrients, but they're at the time in their life cycle when they're starting to pull nutrients down into the root systems. So if we burn in the fall, we can have an impact on what comes back next spring. And another question that a lot of people forget about, what will the neighbors think? Well, why does it matter? Let me show you. So here's a map of Soldier's Delight in Owings Mills. These are the trails. Let's just look at the southeast corner down here. The southeast corner alone, we have about 1,000 townhouses and a few single-family homes. So it is high density population. This is Newtown High School. This is the local county athletic park. This is the Baltimore Ravens training facility. So we do not want a fire to get out of control because we have 3,000 lovely neighbors who have been great. From the time that we started doing these prescribed burns, and they showed up at public meetings and they listened and they pay attention, and we have great neighbors. So we don't want to burn them out of house and home. So that's why we have to pay attention to things that are going to impact our neighbors. So if you haven't prepped for a prescribed burn before, this is kind of our process. We get there are pine trees around some small openings. We decide we're going to connect these openings. So we're going to start nibbling away at them. So first thing we do, the question on the bumpers, or the answer on the bumper sticker, is trees are the answer. What's the question? What are we going to cut down? Now, remember, these are Virginia pine. They are not native to a fire-tolerant ecosystem. So yes, for us, we are indeed killing trees for conservation. I know it's not what they told us in the early 70s when we were supposed to be planting trees for everywhere. But in this case, what we are trying to achieve is a healthy, fully functioning grassland ecosystem. So anybody who's not fire tolerant has to go. And it would not be safe for us to just light it off with the trees there. So we start by minimizing the problems. So we cut them down. If we can't cut them down, or if they're at the edge of an opening and the trees are too big for us to deal with, we will girdle them, let them die standing so they are not providing additional seeds that will repopulate these openings that we're working so hard to keep open. We cut them down, type of work we always do in the winter, but when I took this picture, it was 72 in February. This is the McDaniel College Environmental Club. They're great. I love people with strong knees. But again, we work in the winter when the ground is as firm as it is going to be. So we chip them. we chop up the biomass and we shoot it off the opening that we're creating because we don't want to add organic material to the soil. Now, these Virginia pine piles, at the end of the day, we all smell really good, like a pine air freshener. And some people will say, can't we use them for mulch? Well, here's the thing. We cannot bring in heavy equipment onto the serpentine openings because trucks will actually break up the soil so much that it will have an impact on whether or not rare plants can grow there. So we tell people, well, if you want to walk in with sacks and fill them up and carry them out, you are welcome to do so. However, Virginia pine chips don't last very long. They break down very, very quickly. So they actually don't make good garden mulch. This pile took about 3 years to actually be completely gone and nobody knew it was there. So we started like this. We cut them down. We do a prescribed burn. And the next year, this prescribed burn was done in the fall. The next spring, they were all waiting in the seed bank. So these lovely inflorescences are Indian grass, and it's surrounded by little blue stem, big blue stem. And this grassland comes back by itself if we just reintroduce fire to the landscape and get out of the way. We're not planting any seeds. Planting seeds is the least efficient way to do any kind of restoration. What we are doing is trying to let nature be nature. Now, we call them prescribed burns, which means there are rules under which we can conduct these burns, and this would be the prescription. These are the conditions that we have to have in order to safely pull off a burn. Relative humidity has to be between 28 and 65%. We like it between 30 and 40. If it's above 65%, it's too humid and stuff won't burn. We continue to throw the gasoline diesel mix that we use to light the fires, and it just burns off and the grass doesn't burn. If it's below 30%, 28%, stuff burns too well and we cannot control it. So we try and keep it between 30 and 40. That's a safe and efficient burn relative humidity. We need the winds out of a particular direction so we don't smoke out our neighbors. And we like those winds to be between 3 and 15 miles an hour because the winds will move the fire along and they will provide the oxygen that the fire needs to burn. And we have to have a cloud cover that's less than 50% because we want that smoke to rise and blow away from our neighbors. We don't want it to settle down in the valleys and smoke people out. Before we do a burn, we create fire breaks, which is just the removal of burnable, flammable material around the burn unit. We put signs around the perimeter and we create a map with all the numbers on it so we can direct people to different locations based on the numbers on the signs. We do a walk around with the entire crew so that everybody knows where the safety zones are, where the escape routes are, where the hot spots with some tricky fuel may be. And we have weather reports from before we put fire in the ground and every 15 minutes during the actual burn itself. Once we have a fire break and all of our prescription conditions are met, then we will do a test burn. And we will put a little fire in the ground, and if it doesn't burn the way we want it to burn, if it's too humid or it's burning too fast, we will shut the fire down. We will have our entire crew of 20 people or so there, everybody deployed along the perimeter. But if this test fire does not burn the way we want it to burn, we will shut the fire down, tell everybody, thank you, go home, we'll call you on another day when conditions are better. But if it does burn the way we want, we have ignition. And we have our igniters going around the perimeter, usually one side that the wind will then blow the fire into the burn unit. And you can see that we have burn squads around, and we have our resources like pumper trucks safely placed at particular locations around the perimeter. And off we go. In this case, we actually used the trail as our fire break, which makes our lives a whole lot easier. And you can see the wind here is pushing the fire into the burn unit. And we're just watching it burn. We're not trying to put it out because we want it to burn. And usually we're not actually watching it burn. We're actually looking outside of the burn unit to make sure that nothing outside of the burn unit catches fire. Frank here is wearing a 5-gallon bladder bag, which is 45 pounds. So he is keeping an eye out to make sure there are no embers jumping outside of the burn unit. He's also carrying a hard rake, a fire rake. When there are places where there are tricky fuels and we need to have additional resources there, we will bring, before we actually ignite them, we will make sure that our pumper truck is nearby or the right staff with the right equipment are nearby before we ignite it. Now you can see here that she is igniting some of the dried leaves at the edge of the trail. Over here, we have a humongous patch of dried greenbrier because this is in the fall, and it happens to be wrapped around a pine tree. So when everything is set and all the right people and resources are deployed, she ignites the greenbrier. And honestly, this is about how fast it goes. And then it starts looking scary, and we put it out. So what we do is that we only burn it as much as we can control it. And that's why we had that pumper truck nearby. If this were to go up too high and start a crown fire, those are very, very difficult to control, and they can spit embers into unsafe places. If all things go as planned, if the wind stays the way we want it to stay, and the relative humidity stays the way we want it to stay, and all of these things change throughout the day, so we can change the behavior, our burn behavior as needed. But if everything is working correctly, most of the time, but a good fire is a boring fire. If it gets exciting, that's why we have training. It's actually federally mandated wildland firefighter training. It's the same training that's used by smoke jumpers out in Montana, except they don't teach us how to jump out of airplanes. I'm good with that. So we're eating smoke most of the day. And then at the end of the day, we do what's called mop up. So we will go around the perimeter of the burn unit, and we will extinguish any smoking, any flames within about 30 feet of the perimeter. We don't mind if it's continuing to smolder in the center of the burn unit, because if that spits a spark, it's only going to land on something that's already burned, so it's starved of fuel. Anything on the outside of the unit or on the perimeter of the unit, if it spits a spark or an ember, it can come outside of the unit and cause problems. We do keep somebody on site overnight and into the next day to make sure that it continues going out. Usually at night, relative humidities go up and the wind drops, so it smolders and eventually goes out on its own. There are some times where there are these little microsystems where the humidity is just a little too hot or the soil's a little too moist and they don't burn. And that's fine, because we call those refugia. If there are critters that need to get out of the fire, they can, or plant sources, that they have a place here in a refugia where they don't burn. Certainly there are some animals that do die if they cannot move fast enough to get out of the fire. We do occasionally find a snake or a lizard that can't move fast enough, but we don't burn the entire complex all at once. We only do these patches, so there continues to be habitat for all of these critters. So after burn, we're going to have something like this. And you see these tall stumps from the pines that we cut down. We leave them tall for a reason. Unfortunately, when people see a big open area, sometimes they think that means they can take their four-wheelers and drive through it. And they can't. It's not legal here. They can physically figure out how to do it, but it is not legal to do so. So we leave up some of the stumps to deter some people who would like to trespass with their four-wheelers. But this beautiful oak tree in the middle, this is an old growth oak. I know, old growth. It's not that big. It might be 12 inches in diameter, but remember the soil here is not very deep. And you'll notice that this is actually on a slope where there's going to be slightly deeper soil. It's that slightly deeper silty loam, but it's still not that deep. So trees aren't going to get that big, and there's just not a whole lot of available nutrients for them. So they just don't get big. So this tree could be classified as an old growth oak. It could be a couple 100 years old. They just don't grow very big, but they do grow very artistically. Isn't that a beautiful tree? I love the shape of that tree. This is a result of, I believe, of a spring burn based on the leaf stage on the surrounding oaks. So let's go back to 1993. And remember that there was all of this pine in here. Here's our power line. Here's our visitor center. This is Ward's Chapel Road up here. So we started out with our main restoration area looking like that. By 2002, we had cleared off a lot of this. This is now a true color. So the dark green stuff here is pine. We move forward a few years. 2008, we've cleared out even more. These are actually oak trees, mostly here. And all of these individual trees here are mostly oaks. This is a patch of pine here that we haven't yet removed. One more, 2018, this is really what it looks like now. Let's go back a little bit. So we go from this to here. You'll notice some of these lines. These are not actual trails that the park maintains. These are the trails. These are the remains of some riding routes that a local motorcycle club used to do in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And they are still there, and they will be there for decades to come, because with this soil type, it takes 500 to 1,000 years just to make an inch of soil, because it's really tough bedrock. So when I tell people, please don't trample, please don't move the soil, it's because it takes that long for the soil to recover. But pretty cool. We have this nice big opening now. That's our premier opening. There is some greenbrier in here, but that will get burned up with our next burn. Unfortunately, it's not all about just setting fire safely on the land. We do have to deal with invasive species, as just about every land manager does. Some of the big ones we're dealing with right now are Japanese barberry and stink sumac. Stink sumac is the translation of its Chinese name. You may know it from its marketing name, Tree of Heaven. If someone tried to sell you stink sumac, are you inclined to buy it, or would you be more inclined to buy Tree of Heaven? Exactly. Tree of Heaven is a challenge for us because it can survive fire. Barberry, we do have to treat with herbicides. And we have started treating Tree of Heaven with herbicides, but we kill it first with herbicides before we cut it down, because if we cut it down live, it just root sprouts like crazy. Those are two of our big woody species we have to deal with. In the grassy department, wavy leaf basket grass and Chinese silvergrass. Wavy leaf basket grass was first introduced into the United States in Baltimore County in, I think it was 1996. Right near Patapsco Valley State Park, so literally right down the road from Soldier's Delight. We got about 500 acres of it right now that are underneath the wooded areas because it grows in shade. It's a challenge. If I'm in a good mood, I call it job security. The only good thing about dealing with wavy leaf is that you have to get it in the heat of the summer, July and August, really before it sets seed. When on the outcrop in the openings, it can be 120 degrees, but under the woods, it can be 10 degrees cooler. So that's got that going for it. The other one is Chinese silvergrass, which loves fire. In Asia, where it is native, and they want to make these big, beautiful presentations of silvergrass, they burn it. So this is one that we can't go after with fire because it likes fire. And of course, there's always deer. Back in 2015, the Ecological Society of America conducted their annual conference in Baltimore. And of the 4 days in Baltimore, one whole day, 4 whole conference rooms were devoted to presentations on deer management, all deer all the time. And the take-home message was, if you want to have a balanced ecosystem where the deer are not over-browsing the plants and that there is a healthy ecosystem for other species, plants, and animals to use, you need to keep your deer numbers under 8 deer per square mile. At Soldier's Delight, we did a survey in 2004, and we found out that there were 88 deer per square mile. Around that time, we started with low-key bow hunting, expanded to managed hunts, and when the locals became comfortable with hunting being there, we opened it up for regular deer season, bow hunting, muzzleloader, and firearm season. And we know that there has been a drop in deer, although we have not done another full survey. We know that there are fewer deer there because the plants are getting taller. You can actually see the impact that reduction of the deer herd is having on plants there. We could not do any of this without our crack volunteer crew. We call them SERPers, which is short for Serpentine Ecosystem Restoration Project. They do most of the work in the wintertime. If there's snow on the ground, we love it because then we can actually do brush pile burns and not have to and get a permit from the Baltimore County Fire Marshal's office to do this and not have it be dangerous. But we haven't had snow in the last few years, so we've had to change our tactics a little bit. We have gone after small creeping Virginia pine using loppers, and we flagged Japanese barberry for our herbicide team to come in later. But we could not do this without our volunteers. They help us make the fire breaks. Basically, they are our brush cutter Olympic synchronized team. I mean, it is quite amazing that they just come out and do this. It's yard work writ large, but it's absolutely necessary yard work. I have the great pleasure of working with the Maryland Conservation Corps, which is a crew of people between the ages of 17 and 23. And they work on, I think it's 11-month contracts. They get uniforms, they get a stipend, they get housing, they get training like wildland firefighter training, chainsaw training, herbicide or pesticide application training. For this picture, I asked them to pose like they were in a Sears catalog. The first thing they said was, "What's a Sears catalog?" Generation Z. Oh my goodness. But they are great and they work really well with donuts. I also have the pleasure of working with the Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge's burn team and their equipment. These guys work at Blackwater. All they do is burn marshes. So I heard one guy say he really liked coming up and working with us at Soldier's Delight because it is a completely different ecosystem than a marsh. And these guys, they've been doing it for so long as a team. Working with them, they're like telepathic. They're so very good. We could not do this without a mix of volunteers and staff and our partners. And on a good day, it looks like this. Now, we can't burn in the power line because it's a national security issue, but the BGE's subcontractors mow every year in May, which basically simulates a herd of bison going through and grazing. And every 5 years, they trim any trees that start to encroach upon the power line. So they keep the woody species out of it. Mowing actually also helps keep some of the oak trees very small and shrubby, which is the exact right stage for some of our rare species to use. Now, a couple of the stars of the show there, we have Allegheny mound ants and we have hairstreak butterflies. The hairstreak butterflies really like those shrubby oaks. They need them for laying their eggs. It's one of their host plants, their larval host plants. So if the oaks are too big, the butterflies won't lay their eggs on them. So we need those shrubby oaks, and both fire and mowing helps keep them in that state. The Allegheny mound ants are just cool. They create these mounds that are about 3 feet in diameter, maybe 2 feet tall. They keep them mowed. They trim off all the vegetation, but they do sometimes plant Arabidopsis, rock cress, which acts like a green roof, and it helps maintain the temperature in the mound, which is basically a nursery. And this is what they look like. They're two-toned, black and red. They're always very busy, but you can see how they will prune off the grass so that they can maintain the temperature of the mound. Aren't they cool? I think they're so cool. Some other stars of the show. This beautiful little critter on the left-hand side is the Eastern Sedge Barrens plant hopper. It's only about, 3 millimeters big. And as far as we know, it's the only place on the globe where you will find this critter. I'm not going to tell you where in Soldier's Delight it is. That's confidential. But how cool is that? It is the global population for this little plant hopper. We have lots of skippers and butterflies. I love the picture of the Leonard skipper. I don't love that it's sitting on a non-native thistle, but we can pull those out with fire. So by the numbers, since 1995, when the Serpentine Ecosystem Restoration Project actually started, we have actually over 35,000 hours with our volunteers. And that really should say over 800 volunteers, because I've updated it since then, but they are individual citizens, school groups, scout groups, date groups, corporate teams. We've had 2 marriages come out of volunteering, people volunteering at Soldier's Delight. So, it's kind of a love connection. We have created or restored grassland in approximately 975 acres. When we started, there were about 400 acres of individual small patches that were already in a grassland state. We have actively cleared approximately 500 acres. Doesn't mean we're done, because we have a 1,000 acre restoration goal, but we're not done. We're moving into maintenance phase because conservation is continuous. If we were to stop with the fire and stop with the mowing, we would just have the trees come back in again. So we're now getting into the maintenance phase. Volunteers have helped us with just about every aspect of the management at Soldier's Delight. And indeed, that original group of grassroots volunteers from the 1950s and 60s went on to become, they incorporated themselves. They are the Soldier's Delight Conservation Incorporated. They are the oldest friends group in the Maryland State Park system. And you can see the work that they do on soldiersdelight.org. Now, we're not really post-restoration, but where we are in the process, certainly it is not barren at all. We've got about 35 different species of mammals, 168 birds, and many, many of them are grassland birds, which is really important because there are a lot of grassland birds that are rare, because finding a healthy grassland habitat is also rare. We've got 15 different kinds of reptiles and amphibians. We've got about 25 species of butterflies and skippers. And of those, most of them, 18 of them are uncommon or rare. 267 wildflowers, 200 woody plants, 33 graminoids, 31 ferns and fern allies, 78 lichens, and over 30 rare, threatened, and endangered plant and animal species. So when we are managing an ecosystem, by managing not just the individual species, but the processes themselves, like fire, what we're actually doing is managing for biological diversity. So this is Soldier's Delight now. You can see this is our premier opening, and you can walk right through it on the Serpentine Trail. But as you can see, here are some of the other openings that we're working on expanding. Now, let's go back to the fire from April. A week after the fire, this is what it looked like. It was a little jarring, I will tell you that, but a month later, that oak tree had started to leaf out. And there's grass coming back in. Now, at the bottom of this hill, there's a little stream. I believe it's Chimney Branch. This side did not burn, so you can still see the dead plant matter from the previous year. This year, this is the side that did burn, so you can sort of compare and contrast. So you can see that a lot of things burned, but then a lot of things came back. Now, not all of them did. We have started doing some monitoring work, monitoring some oaks to see how many of them that got burned are coming back, how long it's taking them to come back. Are they only coming back this year? We're going to be monitoring them for at least 3 years to see how they've responded to this fire. So although the fire itself was unplanned and challenging, it has provided us an opportunity to do some monitoring work that we would not have otherwise been able to do. And we have seen that even the ones that were burned over and look totally dead, they are still coming up with some root sprouts. So there is certainly hope. I do encourage you to go hike there because it is absolutely bliss this time of year. All of the Indian grasses, the inflorescences are out, and there's this tall waving golden haze. with dewdrops on the spider webs. It is absolutely sublime. If you do go, it is a little rugged in some places. Do stay on the trail for two main reasons. One for the ecosystem, one for you. Again, if you go off the trail, very often right near the trail are rare plants that are not really obvious, but they are very vulnerable to trampling. So just stay out of the grass, because the second reason is that the ticks here are legion. We have had a couple of volunteers and a couple of staff members, myself included, get Lymes from tick bites here. I spent the last 4 weeks doing field work there, and I would show you my ankles because they're all chewed up from the ticks and the chiggers, but just take my word for it and stay on the trail. When snow happens, it is absolutely lovely, and it's a really cool place to go cross-country skiing. Now, for the last few years, we've been in a sort of a La Nina trend, and we haven't had any snow there. But this year, they're calling for a heavy El Nino. So I'm hoping for big snow, baby, because it is really, really beautiful there in the winter. So I will end my presentation here. If you have any questions, I'm happy to hear them now, or if you'd like, you can email me at paula.becker@maryland.gov. Does anybody have any questions? I'm hearing crickets from the open window in my living room, but hopefully not crickets from you guys. Thank you. Patrick, would you like me to stop the recording? Let me, let's see. All right, Patrick, I have made you host again, so you can unmute everybody if you choose.
I just want to say that I knew a little bit about, I'm a native plant nut, and I knew a little bit about Shoulder's Delight, but it was wonderful to hear all the gory details. So, thank you.
Thank you.
I was going to say, Paula, this was incredible. As an eco restoration major, this is like, fantastic to see what you all have done there. Can't wait to visit. I did put a few questions of my own in the chat. One of them was about wildlife when you're burning. You talked a little bit about that. And I don't know whether you wanted to add any more to that or.
Well, things that can fly, things that can run, will move out of the burn unit. I have stood on a perimeter and have deer and snakes move by me very quickly. But there was also a year where there was a log in the middle of the burn unit. It was an old hollow log. And when we went through putting out smoldering bits, we found a dead snake in there. Nobody enjoys the killing aspect of it, but we also have to remember that when fires were a natural element on the landscape, some things die.
Right.
Now, as far as we know, and as far as our measurements and our surveys tell us, we have not had a reduction in any of the particular animal populations due to prescribed burning. In fact, because we are restoring some of the habitat in a lot of cases, we've had an increase because we're making better habitat for them.
In our trip last Saturday, the leader of it mentioned that in terms of fire, that there were less lightning strike fires than they thought, mainly because of the lightning occurs at the same time as rain, so there was suppression. Have you ever heard of that theory or any data to support that? Or
Well, it depends on where you are. As it turns out, because Soldier's Delight is the highest point in Western Baltimore County, and because of the weather patterns coming from where they do, we get a lot of dry lightning. We get the occasional
Okay.
microburst and little bits of tornado. So usually when there is a lightning strike fire, yes, there is moisture on the ground. So you will get smaller patches of burn and you get refugia in between them. When we have what happened in April, where we had 320 some acres get burned fairly contiguously, we also have to remember that in Maryland, this has been the 5th driest year on record. We're in the middle of a drought. So one of the reasons that it burned the way it did was because it was droughty. Now, that was not a lightning strike. We don't know who or what or how it started at this point, although there's all sorts of rumors and speculation. But we do know that from some records from the native peoples and from the early settlers that the majority of the lightning strike fires did occur in the summer, where we have this, you know, the big gigantic thunderclouds, big anvils in the sky, and sometimes there's dry lightning.
Okay. I think Carol had a question.
Somebody asked about the gentian.
Right, Carol.
They're sort of there. They have dropped so precipitously that we're just waiting for the population to wink out at this point. And the main reasons for that are overbrowsing by deer, trampling by deer and people who don't know that the gentian is there, because unless you know what it looks like without the flower on, it's very difficult to see. And the incursion by microstegium or Asian stiltgrass, another invasive that has come in and has basically swamped the gentian. We do still continue with gentian surveys, but we're just not seeing that many of them. It's really depressing. I mean, we have at its peak in like 1988, there were 8,000 to 9,000 plants there. And now we're lucky if we can find 12, honestly. And there's such localized individuals that we're not even sure that they're able to pollinate.
Yeah, when I was there, oh wow. There weren't many, but there were some small patches along a creek. But it was right where a path, one of the trails went through. And you could see where people were going off trail and just trampling through the banks of the creek.
Yeah, I know the location. I know the location you're talking about, and the trail that goes by it, it's not a real trail. We have people going off trails and making social trails, as they're called in the park biz. And those social trails are just the death knell for a lot of our fragile rare plants.
Yeah, bummer. Thanks for your work. This was a fascinating talk, and now I've got to go back.
Oh, good.
Oh yeah, I want to visit too.
Good.
One other question I had, and maybe that'll be the last, was the name Soldier's Delight. Where did that come from?
I make a bet with myself anytime anybody answers that question, because it has been asked at every time I've given this talk. The short answer is, there are a few different stories as to how it came about. It predated the Civil War. Although during the Civil War, Soldier's Delight was used as an encampment for camp followers, basically. We think the most reasonable explanation has to do with the original English garrison that was built in what is now the Garrison Forest section of Owings Mills. It was a small 20-foot by 20-foot blockhouse. And that was built in 1715, I believe. But that the big open rolling landscape was where the soldiers would, here's two different versions. It was where they would do hunting and R&R. So it was where they went to relax. So it was where they went to delight. The other one is that we do know that there were a lot of skirmishes between the local tribes and the English invaders. And the word delight is used ironically because that's where the soldiers would go to kill the Indians or the native peoples. So it's a tough one, but we do know that the early English garrison would rest, recreate, or get up to trouble in that particular area. So that's where the name came from.
Okay. Do we have any other questions for Paula?
You can always email me. I'm open to emails if you have any questions.
Okay. Well, this is, like I said, this has been fabulous. Thank you so much for doing this for us. Definitely appreciate it greatly, and enjoyed the humor too. That's that made it a lot more fun. So, all right. Well, I hope everyone can go visit, and thanks for joining us tonight. And we're signing off. So, good night, all.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.